But in the meantime, let me get started. I want to thank everybody for joining us in the webinar. We have about an equal number of participants from business and from higher education. I plan less than about 30 minutes to talk. I'm happy to answer questions. Fritz had decided that if it was something that was context dependent, he would interrupt. If not, we could hold them till later. Or if there's that doesn't work, again, I'm always happy to take them online or offline when we're finished. I have a very deep, very long time commitment to critical thinking. Are you making any progress there, Fritz?
Yes, my screen is showing.
Okay. All right. I don't know whether it's showing from me or not.
Yeah, you will.
Okay. And this commitment is really it goes back many, many decades. I've been working in the area since graduate school, and you might guess now, but since I'm a MERITA, that's been quite some time. I've been working on this assessment, collecting data, revising items for over 35 years. So we can't have a deep commitment to enhancing and promoting critical thinking if we don't have a way that's reliable and valid for assessing it. And that's essential to our commitment. Now, have you seen the change in my screen?
No, not yet. I'm on using your presentation and I'm going through it. I've been on the starting page. I'm going to switch to the second page now.
Okay, thank you very much. Why don't you click through the whole second page, enter separately. I probably don't have to convince you that we have to be encouraging much more critical thinking in our students and in our workforce, which our students are preparing for. There are so many examples. It's hard to even know where to begin. 6% of Americans say that the moon landing was staged. Interestingly, that number is even higher outside of the United States, suggesting often that what we believe to be true depends very much on where we live and in our prior beliefs. In Egypt, 43% of people think Israel was behind the 9/11 attacks in America, and that's what we often call, justifying our own thoughts. The idea being that we have beliefs that our prior beliefs affect what we're willing to accept as data and as truth. And certainly in a time when we hear a lot about false news, this is a topic we need to be desperately concerned about. There is, of course, all kinds of beliefs. There is the Flat Earth Society, whose international headquarters are not that far from my home. And you can probably guess what they believe. The Earth is, in fact, flat. And if you go to their website, they're really quite serious about this. There's really almost no end. Could you go to the next slide, please? There's almost no end to the examples. I have an example here from purchasing things that people buy. And this is the Power Band wrist bracelet. Millions have been sold, multiple millions around the world. They sold originally for $30 in the US. It was endorsed as the sports product of the year. And the idea was, if I put on these little bracelets, I become better at my sport. Well, you might guess that that's a very intriguing idea, and millions of people have bought it. Next slide, please. So what is the evidence for it? Well, it turns out that actually in this case, it was the Australian government that said, what is the evidence that this works? And the response from the manufacturer was, quote, there is no credible scientific evidence to support the claims that they were making. And you can see in the first headline, the pseudoscience song remains the same. I could have used examples from medicine. I could have used examples from investment, but clearly there are plenty of people who are very willing to believe in the power of magic and purchase things that affect their life, affects their health, and so many other things. This is important. So I have a short survey, and Fritz, I don't know if you want to take this one over or not. It's the next slide.
Absolutely. We'll give this a try.
Go ahead. Is your company or university using critical thinking assessment?
The poll is in progress, and answers are coming in as we are speaking.
Good.
And I still see some movement, so we have some participants voting. We have 64% participation right now in voting, and if the numbers are above 70 now, so 75, good participation. The numbers are coming in saying that 38% are using critical thinking assessment, 48 do not, 14% have given the answer that they do not know. So we do have a majority of participants who are actually not using an assessment.
Okay, and I'm going to try to explain to you why, at least why I believe it's absolutely critical. Now, I'm sure that some of those assessments that you're thinking about or that people are using involve often, I think, tests or assessments that have unknown reliability, unknown validity. I've been at a university my whole adult life, and I can tell you when I start talking about reliability, validity, and other psychometric measures, people's eyes sort of glass over. So even if those of you are using it, very often it'll be something like a faculty who are grading some senior project then decide whether or not it shows evidence of critical thinking. There are so many things wrong with that kind of assessment. I don't know where to begin. But that is not an uncommon scenario. Let's go on to the next slide, please, Fritz, if you can, where I'm going to ask the question, what is critical thinking? I don't have a short response, and I've never been that big a fan of brevity because it's not a short answer. The short answer would be using those cognitive skills, those abilities, that increase the probability of a desirable outcome. It's a very broad answer that covers a whole range of possibilities. It's a kind of thinking that's purposeful, it's reasoned, and it's goal-directed. And it's usually helpful to give examples of what I'm talking about. It's solving a problem, formulating an inference, a likelihood, a decision. And critical thinking is not just a skill, it's really an attitude. It's a way of thinking about the world. So without prompting, and usually with conscious intent, someone stops and goes through a series of thought questions that help them think what they need to know, what they should be knowing. It is a predisposition to think critically. And when we're doing it, we're looking at the quality of the thought process, not just the outcome. How well did you think through it? What else you could have done differently, evaluating the process itself involved in making a decision. Next slide, please. More succinctly, since that's sort of a long kind of definition, it's comprehending complex information at a deep level. So if I want you to do something creative with new information, if I want you to use it in ways that allow you to make inferences, you have to understand it not at a shallow level, but at a deeper level, and recognizing and avoiding common biases. I think critical thinking is really the antidote for the chaos of our times. We hear an awful lot now about false news, and I think one thing this false news epidemic is doing is it's creating a much bigger spotlight on the need for critical thinking. Facts are considered relative, and truth is taking a back step to what is popular. So what I mean more specifically is, can you see both sides of a controversy? Can you engage in a dialogue and take in information, avoiding name calling, so that, as a way of handling a disagreement or thinking about information that you may not necessarily like? Next slide, please. There are lots of definitions, but they're not really all that different. If you look across the literature, you find that sometimes the words used, sometimes there's little difference in what's emphasized, but in fact the ideas all come around the same few ideas, using available evidence, purposely trying to overcome individual biases. It's not the same as intelligence. One can score very high in IQ and in fact not show very much critical thinking, and we have lots and lots of research and evidence that back up these statements. I only have a few references here, but I have large numbers of references for the statements that I'm making. Next slide, please. We know that employers want critical thinking in their prospective and current employees. These various surveys are done annually, some of them are biannually, but pretty much they say the same things from year to year. And, you know, employers want employees who communicate effectively, both orally and in writing. But you can't communicate effectively if you can't think clearly. I am sure we've all had the experience of seeing things where the words are strung together and almost make sense, but with a little deeper reading, you're left thinking, huh? You know, the idea here is you have to think clearly to communicate effectively. They want critical thinking and analytical reasoning. They want people to solve problems, which is certainly part of our definition of critical thinking, work together with others, innovate, be creative. You can't innovate and be creative if you're not understanding, if you're making common kinds of thinking errors. Evaluate information, what's good information, what's bad information, and certainly working with numbers is important. So this is all things that employers want. Next slide, please. 92% of employers said, and this is a quote, a demonstrated capacity to think critically, communicate clearly, and solve complex problems is more important than a candidate's undergraduate major. Those of us who are in universities spend a lot of time helping students find the right major. Maybe we should be spending more time being sure that they're getting the kinds of thinking skills that they need regardless of what their major is. I know all universities are required to assess learning outcomes. I know that's a requirement in the U.S. for accreditation. I have been on accreditation panels plenty of times, and we tend to put most of our evaluation efforts in the major, and I really believe we need to be spending much more time, much more effort going across majors and looking at the skills. The kind of information we collect could be used in a variety of ways, and that's up to each institution, each company. It could provide individual information for test takers. So for example, you might be able to tell an individual that you did well in these areas, but you're really not doing well in thinking about likelihoods and uncertainty, for example. You can use it to demonstrate the quality of your general education curriculum and really give everyone feedback on how much they have gained in a critical thinking program. Can be used in a variety of ways. We know this is what employers want. Next slide, please. We know that every job category is facing novel problems. The nature of the workplace is changing at an increasingly rapid rate. If you take a long view, I mean, a generation ago, the same people who would have thought, do I need to finish high school, now know that in order to get a passport to middle class, they need a college degree. And their jobs are changing. Familiar responses do not work for a very long time. With everything rapidly changing, company life is much more complex than it ever was, and people need a much higher level of learning than they did in the past. Next slide, please. Now, what do I mean when I talk about critical thinking skills? I have long lists of skills. I have them sorted into a variety of categories, and people can decide for themselves which are most important in their workplace, which are most important in a student's major. But the kind of thing that I'm talking about, do you recognize semantic slanting? Do you recognize guilt by association? Does a person actually seek out contradictory evidence? Do they stop looking for evidence or only favor ones that support what they believe to be true? Do they monitor their thinking as they're going through it? Do they make risk-benefit assessments? And I have a long list here, understanding basic research principles. So for example, do they recognize that they cannot generalize from a small sample? This is not just true in STEM disciplines, this is true everywhere. This is true if they're a history buff. This is true if they're deciding how to handle a sales program. It's the same basic principle, but it cuts across all kinds of situations. Can they create a matrix or a diagram and synthesize information, determine the credibility of information? So these are just some examples. I have many more for anyone who is interested in looking at these and thinking about what I mean by critical thinking skills. Next slide, please. This is not new. You have to hit it 3 times, Fritz, to get the whole slide in. There's nothing new in this push for critical thinking. Paul Meehl, who will be a name that's familiar to those who are in psychometrics or psychology, he was stopped attending case conferences at hospitals because of really sloppy thinking patterns. And he said a casual anecdote about one's demented uncle, as remembered from childhood, is given the same group interest and intellectual respect that's accorded to the citation of a high-quality research study. And boy, I can say that is so true. In recent years, I've spent a lot of time giving expert testimony. And in expert testimony, I go before a judge, I go before a committee, and I literally give them information from a meta-analysis based on 1.5 million people. And when I'm done, presenting my case, it's not at all unusual. It almost happens every time. Someone will say, oh yeah, but I know someone who, and it's someone who goes against the conclusion of 1.5 million people, is in favor of the conclusion. It doesn't matter. I know someone who, and that vivid example of, my Aunt Tessie did this and it worked, is given as much, if not more, respect as the 1.5 million people meta-analysis. And I think you can, if you sit around the tables at lunch, kitchen tables, if you ride the bus, you'll hear people doing this all the time. They really love anecdotal evidence, and one has to be really specifically trained to be aware of it. Next slide, please. Critical thinking is not the same thing as intelligence. IQ tests measure and predict a number of outcomes, but it's only a small subset. IQ tests will often look at your visual spatial abilities, your ability to know the meanings of words, how much information you can maintain in short-term memory. But what it doesn't do is tell you what you do with that information once it's in short-term memory. And it's really qualitatively different. And again, I have so many examples where people score high in IQ and are surprisingly make all sorts of errors in critical thinking. Keith Stanovich, a psychologist who's done a lot of research in this area, and he said rational thinking can be surprisingly dissociated from intelligence. And I'll come back to this point in a few minutes to say that they are clearly not the same thing. Next slide, please. Gave you a little bit of background in critical thinking, and my sincere belief that if we are concerned with it, we need to be able to assess it. And the Halpern critical thinking assessment is really alone in several ways. It actually predicts the real outcomes of critical thinking, and I'll explain that. Next slide, please. It has a theoretical background. It's designed to assess common constructs found in the definition of critical thinking. It's designed to improve the scope of educational psychology so we can think about enhancing and improving critical thinking and refine personnel selection processes, corporation and industries, as well as critical thinking training programs. So it's designed for a number of theoretical kinds of uses that would be common for assessments. Next slide, please. It's based on what we called facets or components of critical thinking. And the definition comes from a variety of experts, and it's divided into 5 sub-areas: verbal reasoning, sort of comprehending persuasion, understanding persuasion, argument analysis, you know, how well do the reasons support a conclusion, that sort of thing. Hypothesis testing, the idea being that much of real life thinking is thinking like a scientist, but not just in scientific context, in everyday context as well. One of my favorite involved some people who were arguing over who's the best hip-hop artist. And someone says, well, you know, you need to have an operational definition of hip-hop artists to answer that question. So that's really taking the skills of hypothesis testing and using them in everyday thinking. Likelihood and uncertainty, if not much is known with absolute certainty, and you need to understand probabilities and likelihoods, and decision-making and problem-solving, using multiple problem statements. So what really is the problem that we're solving? Can we state it in several different ways? And each time we have a different statement, we come up with a different set of possible solutions. These are the 5 facets, and we actually get 5 subscores because critical thinking is not a univariate concept. It's multivariate, and it needs to be measured in multivariate ways. The test itself has 2 test forms. It uses scenarios that are short and that are familiar to people. And we know that the way we ask people to respond is going to be very important in the kinds of scores we get. So what we actually have is individuals see the same scenario twice. The first time, they give an open-ended, constructed response. And then the second time, that goes away. They see the same scenario, but they're given a variety of forced choice options, multiple choice. Cognitive psychologists know that the underlying cognitive processes in recognizing a possibly correct answer are really different from those that are involved in generating or constructing an answer. And we actually use both forms, and I know of no other assessment that does it. There's alternate forms, of course, to protect for item memories and test-retest, and it's we've had it translated into multiple different languages and used around the world. Very often, critical thinking tests will have only multiple choice questions. They're fast to grade, they're cheap to administer, but they really only give us a small set of an idea of how well someone can think critically. People might avoid the open-ended constructed response because they're harder to grade, but actually think we've come up with an ingenious way of making them easier and making them more reliable. And let me try to explain. So we have, here's some examples, 20 everyday kinds of scenarios. You're trying to decide which of 2 weight loss programs will best help an overweight friend of yours lose weight permanently. You have brochures of 2 reputable programs. One claims the average weight loss is 25 pounds. The other says it's 30 pounds. Both programs cost the same. So you'll get this scenario. And first, the individual has a free recall. They write something out. Then that screen goes away, and they have a recognition or forced choice. So here's what it would look like. What are two questions that you would ask the program representatives in deciding which program to recommend to your friend? So there's some number of good questions that one would ask. You might ask about dropout rates. You might ask about how long the program is. Maybe the 25-pound program was 6 months and the 30-pound program was 2 years. So there's a number of questions that you would ask, and you have a short space, a succinct answer, and then you would put the 2 in. Then after that, you would be given a multiple choice, in this case, a series of them. Rate the following statements in terms of how useful the information is. So how useful would it be to know how many people are in your program? Maybe the one with 25 pounds loss had 100, and the one with the 30-pound loss had 5. So how important would it be? And we expect people to say that it's important. And then for the grading, what we have done to keep the grading easy and fast and reliable, when after the assessment is taken and you're going to actually grade the answers, a series of questions pop up on the screen. So given the answer they said, so this one was, over which time period was the weight loss done? So how much did they weigh at the start and the end? Not indicated. What was the number of participants? Not indicated. What regime did they follow? How long did it take? Well, it's clearly indicated. You would click that, and then when you're finished, it goes on to the next question. This kind of grading of open-ended questions, make it easy, make it fast, make it reliable. So here's an example, another example of an open-ended question. After a televised debate on capital punishment, viewers in one state were encouraged to log on to the website and vote to indicate if they're for or opposed to capital punishment. Within the first hour, almost 1,000 people voted, and with close to half voting for each position. The news anchor for this station announced the results the next day. He said people in his state were evenly divided on the issue of capital punishment. So, given these data, would you agree? Yes or no? And then what suggestions might you have for improving the study? And you might type in 2 suggestions. You have a relatively short space. What do you think of as a way that would make this better, make the data more meaningful? Here's an example of answers. I would try to get a sample that's more representative of the state, not just people who can use the internet to answer. So maybe this is not a representative sample. I would not rely on the people who saw this show to decide what's true. And then that would be followed up with the multiple response format. Click the button next to all statements that are true or probably true. Probably true, within your best estimate, your knowledge of the world. Many people went to their computer to vote. These are many people who had viewed the show. About half of all women and half of all men favor capital punishment. The pro side and the con side were equally convincing. People who watched the show and voted may not be representative of the people in the state. People who voted probably feel stronger about this topic than those who don't vote. And this is someone's responses, and then they're all combined into a single score. We have, as I said, it is a multi-dimensional construct. So you get a single score on critical thinking, and then you get one separated into each of the 5 sub-areas, and you have separate scores for recognition and for free recall, or what we're calling constructed response. And you can put all those together to try to understand how an individual is thinking. There are a number of tests available. Recognition tests or multiple choice tests, and here are a few. Recall is what I'm calling constructed response, and only the Halpern critical thinking assessment actually uses both. And if for really cognitive reasons, for a whole host of reasons, and again, I can point you to more references if you're interested, it's the combination of two kinds of responses that actually make a difference. Next slide, please, Fritz, okay? So now we have another poll. Fritz, you want to take it over?
Absolutely. Let's start our second poll today.
This is really meant to be a little bit funny, so, okay.
And I see some votes coming in.
Okay. Does it seem ironic to be assessing critical thinking with multiple choice tests? Yes, no. And you really should ask the question not like a multiple choice test. You should really use a constructed response for this question.
Well, we have another 60% of our participants that have already voted on this, and I will close the poll in a few seconds and show you the results.
And why is a constructed response a better measure of critical thinking? Okay. Okay.
So you should be seeing the results now of our poll, where it says that 40% do agree that it is quite ironic to have only multiple choice answer formats. 15% do not agree, but the majority of all says, well, there should actually be a constructed response answer option to our poll here.
Yes, I mean, it was meant to be a little funny. The no's I can understand. A very good multiple choice question can often get at a good answer. However, it really doesn't tell you about the propensity to think through something. It's how well can they recognize it. That has some meaning. I'm not saying that that's not a good measure. I'm saying that really these are two different processes, and very little in real life is multiple choice. Certainly for the kinds of deep thinking that we're talking about, we really want to see what people are thinking when they are not given an answer to recognize. But we, certainly multiple choice tests have the ability of being quick, being cheaper, and, certainly have some advantages. Next screen, please. Okay. Areas of application, some possibilities, student learning outcomes. Those of you who are at universities certainly have heard a lot about student learning outcomes over the last few decades, since you are all required to demonstrate it as a condition for federal aid in the United States. And actually, this is true in many other places around the world. I have international data as well. You could use it to compare freshmen and seniors, or the same person longitudinally over 4 years and look at growth. You can look at juniors who are native, that is those who have been at your university for the first 2 years, and compare it to those who have transferred into your university. So there's a number of important outcomes. It can be given to the individual. It can be used at the university level. In terms of educational psychology, it tells us a lot about learning critical thinking, useful admission criteria. It can be used in pre-employment testing. It can be used in organizations for promotions and retention decisions. It can be given to administrators as they're entering, and really provide all kinds of feedback. It has been used by the military in a number of different studies, not just U.S. military, but others. I think that the military has understood, certainly does, that the old kind of warfare of two different armies facing each other down and walking in straight rows is certainly no longer the way war is currently waged. It is a thinking war, and it is a way of avoiding war. So it's been used in a number of military settings, in HR settings, in employment settings. Next slide, please. What do we want from it? Well, it has to be objective. And computerized presentation is objective in that everyone gets the same information. There's those of you who are concerned about fairness in testing. This is very important. Scoring is objective. Forced choice calculations, the multiple choice, of course, is objective. And the free recall is scored in a way that maintains consistency because of the scoring prompts. The interpretation of results guidelines are clear and objective and get printouts for individuals. Next slide, please. Construct validity. Very important, not the sort of things that you'll usually hear unless you're talking about someone who knows about psychometrics, but are you really measuring what you think you're measuring? And here are quotes from a whole variety of studies, and certainly it has correlations, low correlations, with the sorts of things you would expect it to be correlated with. Evidence for general thinking factor and separability, and they do separate. For recognition and free recall, facets have been obtained. Various studies have demonstrated a correlation between tests of fluid intelligence and different facets of critical thinking, need for cognition and conscientiousness, personality variables have significant but low correlations. I mean, these are correlated positively with what you would expect it to be, but not so high that they are, in fact, the same measure. The factor structure that I showed earlier has been confirmed in a variety of studies using different techniques. Next slide, please. Criterion. Very hard to get a good criterion for good thinking. What do people do in real life? And I'm going to tell you about that in a few minutes. But it's correlated with the sorts of things that it would have to be correlated with and criterion. It's National Standardized Scholastic Achievement Tests. It's been used in US, Spain. It's been used in Netherlands. It's been used in China. I don't know, a number of countries, and we have those data. Correlates low with GPA, but GPA is a very mushy kind of score. They range all over the place and really doesn't give us that much information. And in fact, with the rise in GPA, we can rely on it less and less because we have too many people getting very high grades. Here is a range of the correlations on a variety of measures. So it correlates where you would expect it to, but not so high that it's a redundant variable and doesn't add important information. Next slide, please. Reliability. These are Cronbach alphas. Cronbach alphas are sort of roughly, and I know we have some psychometricians on the line, it correlates roughly with how well the test items hang together. These are fairly good, especially where we're talking about constructed responses, so that we do have a test that has good psychometric measures. The effect of raters on test scores, and the idea is here, one problem with the constructed response was low reliability. When we looked at the reliability between test graders, we found that they were not significant on any of the free recall measures because of the technique that we came up with of making it much more objective in how you grade the open-ended responses. Last survey question. Do you find it difficult to convince other people who are involved in decisions about assessment that they should really care about things like construct validity? And yes, few people understand why psychometrics are critical. Nope, I work with people who understand it, and I'm not sure. Some people shut off when I show them numbers. Fritz, you want to take it away?
Actually, we don't have this survey built in the presentation, so anybody who wants to comment on it can use the question box.
Okay. I know many of you deal in companies, in university settings, in military settings, with a variety of people who really don't understand the importance of validity and reliability and other important psychometric measures, and yet they're critical to what we're doing. And I think a lot of the measurement that's done is using measures that have do not have good properties and therefore cannot be useful. Next one, please. Well, what don't we have? What we don't have thus far is validations based on real-world outcomes. That is there things in real life outside of test taking, outside of the things we expected to correlate, that actually show that being a better critical thinker has real life outcomes? And the answer is yes, although those data are extremely hard to collect, as you might guess. Next slide, please. This is not my work, this is the work of a colleague, Heather Butler. But in the first study she and her colleagues did, she gave the critical thinking assessment, and she also gave people the real-world outcomes measures. It's sort of an inventory of life events. Next slide, please. The real-world outcomes measure was adapted from a measure that was published, and here's the information from it. And it has events that range in severity and domain. And she added some additional items to the measure. And essentially, a measure is one of, have you ever done X? And if you have, what has happened to it? And then look at the number of, in this case, negative outcomes in real life events. Next slide, please. So for example, have you ever rented a movie? And then have you ever paid a late fee? Have you ever been to jail? Have you missed a payment on your rent? And so forth. It's a whole list of items where you would expect, the ability to think through things and plan better would have an important outcome. Next slide, please. It's calculated by looking at the number of poor decisions over the possible decisions, and it ranges from 0 to 1, and about 27% of the decisions that were done were poor ones. Next slide, please. And found a significant negative correlation. That is, people who had more negative decisions scored lower on the critical thinking assessment. The numbers were actually much higher for a sample of community adults. In this study, I think there were college students and a sample of community adults. And the reason we're pretty sure that happened is the real-world outcomes measure was really geared toward adults living on their own in the community. And so you have a much stronger score since they've had much more opportunity to respond yes or no to the various options. In the next slide, you might think, well, what was missing from that study? And as far as we know, that's really the first real study that has looked at critical thinking assessment and tried to compare it to things that happen in the real world. But what was missing in that study is maybe just these people were more intelligent. So they scored higher on critical thinking and on IQ tests. So in fact, what she did in the next study was actually look at our scores on the critical thinking assessment as well as scores on the IQ test. And if we could have the next slide, please. And just a second about pros and cons. And what she found was that critical thinking had accounted for a larger percent of the variance in the real world outcomes. It was separable from IQ, and when IQ was entered first into the equation, it accounted for a significant proportion of the response. That is, it was not the same as intelligence, in many ways more important than intelligence in looking at what people say they do outside of testing situation in the real world, and that manuscript is currently under review. So I have some pros and cons. It uses multiple response formats, which gives us a lot more information. It covers all facets of critical thinking. There are multiple findings about validity. It has high inter-rater reliability. There are cross-cultural equivalencies for many languages. The con is scoring the free response questions do take additional time and additional cost, although it is possible if you purchase the test to have them scored for you, so you could either purchase them already completely scored or not. And there is some training time in getting whoever is going to be doing the scoring so that there is good reliability. So there are a number of reasons, pro and con, for using the critical thinking assessment, and we believe the pros seriously outweigh the cons. Next slide, please. This was just a small sample study, not a small sample, but a small study. And again, this is the work of Heather Butler, and she said, gave them information about those sneakers. You may be familiar with sneakers that were offered a while ago. They had a little bump on them somewhere, and they toned your whole body, and the more you walked, the better you did. People who scored high on critical thinking were not only less likely to buy these toning shoes, they were able to explain why. And so, there's all sorts of examples. Next slide, please. It predicts real-world outcomes. It expands criterion validity. It predicted real-world outcomes. It highlights the importance of critical thinking, and it has important implications for hiring, for promotion, for retention, and for evaluating the quality of our educational programs for critical thinking. Next slide, please. It's been replicated internationally. We have a number of studies from around the world that have used it. And next slide, please. I guess it was Bertrand Russell who said, most people would sooner die than think. In fact, they do. And certainly a wise man. And the last slide, thank you for your time. For contact information, feel free to write to me, diane.halpern@cmc.edu, or look over more information on my website, www.dianehalpern.com. And thank you very much.